Hi, I'm Eric Jurgensen, a hobbyist blacksmith based in Oklahoma City. Welcome to my basement shop. I've had several people ask me what model of LH-15a to buy. That was a surprising question at first because I did not originally know there were two models. The actual difference is there's a 110 volt model and a 220 volt model. Buy the 220 volt model. That's the short answer. The reasoning is this. The 110 volt model to produce rated power would require 70 amps of current. Now this discussion really applies only to folks in the United States. In the United States we have 220 power coming to our houses, but it actually comes as two halves of 110 volts. It's kind of like a center tap transformer if you're familiar with the electronics there. So you've got 110 volts on the one hand and 110 volts on the other hand, but if you put them together you get 220 volts on the difference. So all the 220 volt circuits actually go across 210 volt poles, and the ground is actually in the middle. It has some advantages, one of which is at no time is your actual voltage 220 volts away from ground. So you have some slight benefits in terms of safety. But in any case, this is what we've got, and it happens to be 60 hertz. Here's the other side. 60 hertz is irrelevant. These machines are not sensitive to the 50 or 60 hertz difference between the US and other locales that use 50 hertz. So if you have 110/220 volt power, US style, you still probably want the 220 volt model, even though it's labeled 220 volts, 50 hertz. 50 hertz has nothing to do with it. I've contacted the manufacturer. They assure me that it works. I've been inside the unit. I can see that there are no components sensitive to a 50 or 60 hertz difference. Now, here's my story. This will potentially help you if you already have a unit and want to extend its capability. I bought a unit from a vendor that was relatively new selling them. The vendor was very helpful and friendly, but when I got my model, it didn't work. Well, now I know, more than a year later, almost 2 years later, I got a 110 volt model. 110 volt model, 70 amps, doesn't work. But I didn't know that, and looking at the labeling, see, in this picture it's 110 volts times 2. Well, that's actually how US current works in a certain interpretation. No, it's not 110 volts times 2. This is what the 110 volt model looks like on the back. And when I was getting this clarified, I sent a picture just a few months ago to the manufacturer, and they said, yeah, you got the 110 volt model. I rewired it to work with 220. And now I basically have a 110/220 unit. Not that I've ever used it off of 110, but it would still work off of 110. The manufacturer was curious as to what I'd done. I sent them the schematic, and they said, yeah, that would work. No guarantees here, and if you don't know what you're doing, don't mess around with 220 volts. If you do know what you're doing, here's my schematic. It is typical for a high-power US appliance to use 220 volts only for the high-power portion of the circuit. So, for instance, a clothes dryer would power the heating element with the 220, but the logic power would be 110. This induction heater is wired so similarly to that I initially thought my 110 unit was a miswired 220 volt unit. The high-powered components in my unit are identical to the ones in the 220 volt unit, and they are all switched with the switch on the back. They don't go through the front panel at all. It's only the logic that goes through the front panel. So I wired the power terminals on the back to the two poles of 220. In the 110 volt model, the logic power supply transformer and the contactor are rated for 110 volts. So I figured out which of the two hots I could cut and run to ground. This does create a ground fault. It really should have been a neutral, but the 220 volt supply to my shop does not have the fourth wire. So if you know what you're doing, you could actually modify yours. If you have some other purpose where you don't need the full output and 110 works for you, great. However, it's very uncommon to have more than a 20 amp 110 circuit in a US home. The 220 circuits go 30 and 40, usually 50, 30 and 50 amps. So if you have an electric hot water heater or something, you have a circuit like that, and you could put a circuit in like I did for your system. I put in a 30 amp circuit. Fortunately, I used a gauge that could go up because the 30 amp circuit was perfect for my welder, but when I added the induction heater, I needed 40 amps to really run it at full rating. Again, the short answer is buy the 220 volt unit, no matter where you live, and put in a circuit for it. 220 volts comes into any US house, and then you're not using 70 amps, which requires extremely thick copper. So there you go. Buy the 220 volt unit. Ignore the fact that one is rated 110 60 hertz and the other is rated 220 50 hertz. No. The frequency does not matter. Yes, 220 50 hertz. It's compatible with that, but it is not limited to that. It will work on 220 60 hertz. That's the unit you want.